The moment the man stood up and left his seat, the entire restaurant seemed to inhale at once. Plates paused midair, a violin note wavered, and the woman at the candlelit table stared at the empty chair across from her as if it had personally betrayed her. That was when I stepped forward, because my daughter was tugging my sleeve, because the hostess was flustered, and because I had no idea that sitting down in that abandoned seat would quietly change the direction of my life. I hadn't planned to be there. I was a single dad on a rare night out, my 6-year-old asleep at my sister's apartment upstairs while I waited below for takeout I couldn't afford to mess up. The restaurant was full, every chair claimed, and when the hostess apologized for the delay, my daughter's small voice asked if we were going to be late again. That was when I noticed the empty seat. The man who'd been there moments earlier was already at the door, his coat half on, his jaw tight. He didn't look back. The woman he left behind didn't cry or shout. She just folded her hands, steady and proud, like someone used to surviving disappointment in silence. "Sir," the hostess whispered to me, "would you mind sitting there for a moment? Just until we sort things out." I glanced at the table, white linen, untouched wine, a future that had clearly been planned and then cancelled without warning. I hesitated, then nodded. My daughter climbed into my lap, sleepy and trusting, and I took the seat her ex had walked out on. Up close, the woman smelled faintly of rain and citrus. Her eyes were sharp but tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. She looked at me, then at my daughter, and something softened. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have to do this." "It's okay," I replied. "We're used to waiting." That made her smile, just a little. Enough to reveal sadness underneath. We sat in an awkward silence until the waiter returned, confused, glancing between us. The woman nodded once. "We'll have another menu," she said. "For him." That was how it started. A conversation born from inconvenience and kindness. She asked my daughter her name. My daughter asked if the woman was a princess. I laughed, embarrassed, but the woman laughed too, really laughed, and said, "Only on weekends." She introduced herself as Elena. Just Elena. No last name. No title. She asked what I did. I told her the truth: warehouse shifts, night classes, coffee brewed too strong because sleep was a luxury. She listened like it mattered. Like I mattered. When the food came, my takeout forgotten, she insisted we share. She told me the man who left was her ex, that they'd tried again because sometimes familiarity feels safer than hope. I told her about my wife, gone too young, how every chair at my table had felt empty since. The candle burned low. My daughter fell asleep against my chest. And in that moment, the world felt smaller, kinder, and unbearably fragile. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that the woman beside me owned half the skyline we could see through the window. That her name was whispered in boardrooms and printed in magazines I'd never read. That she was a billionaire who'd learned early how to disappear behind simplicity. When the bill came, I reached for my wallet. She gently stopped me. "Please," she said. "Let me." I didn't argue. Pride is a luxury too. We said goodbye outside, the city humming around us. She offered me her number, scribbled on a receipt. "In case you ever want to talk," she said. "Or sit somewhere again." I went home that night thinking it was just a beautiful interruption. A reminder that strangers could still be kind. I didn't expect anything else. But days later, my phone buzzed. A message from Elena. A coffee invitation. Then another. We talked about books, about fear, about how loneliness doesn't always look lonely from the outside. She met my daughter properly this time, brought coloring pencils and listened to long stories about imaginary dragons. She never flaunted wealth. Never corrected me when I assumed she worked long hours like I did. The truth came out accidentally. A news article on a cafe TV. Her face. Her name. A net worth that made my breath catch. I felt foolish, small, angry at myself for believing someone like her could exist in my world. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She looked at me with the same steady honesty she'd shown that first night. "I wanted to be seen," she said. "Not measured." I pulled away. Fear does that. For weeks, I told myself I was protecting my daughter, protecting my heart. But one evening, my daughter asked why Elena didn't visit anymore. And I realized the biggest risk wasn't loving someone powerful, it was teaching my child to walk away from something real because it felt intimidating. I called her. My voice shook. We met again at the same restaurant. Same table. Same chair. This time, no one walked out. She told me about the pressure, the isolation, how money had never insulated her from heartbreak. I told her about learning to ask for help, about how strength isn't standing alone, it's choosing to sit down even when you're scared. That night, I understood something simple and profound: life doesn't change when billionaires rescue single dads or fairy tales come true. It changes when two people decide to stay, to listen, to build something honest from the ruins of what didn't work before. Years later, when people ask how we met, I tell them the truth. A seat was empty. Someone had walked away. And instead of leaving too, I sat down, unaware that the woman beside me wasn't just wealthy beyond imagination, but rich in the ways that actually matter. Because sometimes the miracle isn't who you sit next to. It's choosing not to stand up and leave. The second time I saw Elena, I almost didn't recognize her, not because she looked different, but because the place did. No white tablecloths this time. No violin. Just a quiet neighborhood cafe with chipped mugs and sunlight spilling across scratched wooden tables. She was already there, sleeves rolled up, stirring her coffee like she'd been waiting for something more than caffeine. When she looked up and smiled, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since before loss taught me to be careful. My daughter ran to her without hesitation. That scared me more than anything. Children sense truth faster than adults, and my daughter had decided Elena was safe. Elena knelt to her level, listened to every word, treated her stories like they were priceless secrets. Watching them together felt like standing at the edge of something beautiful and dangerous all at once. We talked for hours. About nothing. About everything. About how silence can be heavier than noise. About how people leave without slamming doors, and how that somehow hurts more. Elena never once checked her phone. Never acted bored. When I apologized for rambling, she shook her head and said, "I don't get to hear real life very often." I laughed then, not understanding how true that was. Days turned into weeks. Elena slipped into our routine so gently it felt accidental. She brought groceries once when she found out my paycheck hadn't cleared. She sat on the floor helping with homework. She listened when I talked about fear, real fear, the kind that comes from knowing someone depends on you completely. She never offered solutions, just presence. And somehow, that changed everything. Then came the night the truth found me before she could. I was folding laundry when the TV murmured in the background. A familiar face appeared on the screen. Her face. The name beneath it made my hands go numb. Billionaire. CEO. One of the richest women in the country. I sat down hard on the couch, the room spinning as every memory replayed itself under a harsher light. The cafe. The shared food. The way she'd insisted on paying without hesitation. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, fear had sharpened into anger, not at her wealth, but at myself for forgetting my place in the world. When I asked her about it, my voice wasn't gentle. She didn't flinch. She listened. Then she said something that broke me open. "I never lied," she said softly. "I just didn't lead with money. I wanted to know if someone would sit with me even when there was nothing to gain. I wanted to believe her. I really did." But love feels different when power enters the room. I imagined headlines, whispers, my daughter growing up in a world I couldn't protect her from. So I stepped back. I told Elena we lived in different realities. That my life was small and fragile, and I couldn't risk it shattering. She didn't argue. That hurt more than anything. Weeks passed. The apartment felt emptier than it ever had after my wife died. One night, my daughter asked if Elena had done something wrong. I told her no. She thought for a moment and said, "Then why did you leave?" Children don't accuse. They observe. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't been protecting my heart, I'd been running from it. I called Elena. My voice shook. She answered immediately, like she'd been hoping. We met again at the same restaurant, the same table, the same chair. The seat her ex had walked out on. The seat I'd taken without knowing what it meant. I'm scared, I admitted. Of not being enough. Of being seen as charity instead of choice. She reached across the table and held my hand. I don't need saving, she said. And I don't need someone impressive. I need someone who stays. That was the night I learned the difference between wealth and worth. Between power and presence. I didn't know where our story would end. But for the first time in years, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking away from that seat again. The first time Elena stepped fully into my world, it wasn't with security or sleek cars or anything that matched the woman from the headlines. It was with grocery bags cutting into her fingers and a crooked smile when the elevator stalled between floors. She laughed it off, sitting on the floor beside my daughter, turning a broken moment into a game. That was when I understood something quietly powerful. She wasn't visiting my life, she was willing to live inside it. Still, fear doesn't disappear just because you decide to stay. It changes shape. Mine became whispers at night. What happens when her world collides with mine? What happens when people look at me and see a placeholder, not a partner? Elena sensed it. She always did. She never rushed me, never demanded reassurance. She showed me instead, by showing up. She came to school events where folding chairs squeaked and coffee tasted burnt. She cheered louder than anyone when my daughter stumbled through her lines in the school play. She didn't hide when other parents stared, trying to place her face. She just smiled, proud in a way that had nothing to do with status. The collision I feared came sooner than expected. One afternoon, a black car waited outside my building. A driver stepped out, crisp and careful, asking for Elena by her full name. Neighbors peeked through curtains. My stomach dropped. Elena squeezed my hand before I could pull away. "This is the part one can't erase," she said. "But it doesn't have to erase us." She invited me, us, into her world next. Not the glossy version the media adored, but the human one underneath. Boardrooms where people spoke over each other. Decisions that affected thousands. Pressure that never slept. Watching her there was like watching someone carry a storm with grace. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt necessary. I grounded her. I reminded her to eat. To laugh. To breathe. But love is tested not by comfort, but by sacrifice. The offer came like a beautifully wrapped threat. A long-term move overseas. Expansion. Legacy. Everything she'd built pointed toward yes. Everything she was building with us pointed toward no. I told her I wouldn't be the reason she shrank her dreams. She told me I wasn't a reason, I was a choice. The night before her decision, my daughter climbed into Elena's lap and asked if she was going to disappear like everyone else eventually does. Elena held her tightly, eyes wet, and promised something I'd never heard her promise before. "I stay," she said. "Even when it's hard." She turned down the move. The headlines called it surprising. Analysts called it emotional. They were wrong. It was intentional. She restructured instead. Delegated. Changed the shape of power so it fit around love instead of crushing it. Years later, that restaurant chair still sits by the window. Sometimes we walk past it, hand in hand, my daughter between us, swinging our arms. We never sit there anymore, not because we forgot, but because we remember. That empty seat taught us everything. That love isn't about who walks out. It's about who sits down. And who stays. The real test of our story didn't arrive with headlines or boardrooms. It arrived quietly, the way life's hardest moments usually do, wrapped in ordinary days. My daughter got sick that winter. Not the kind of sick that earns sympathy cards and casseroles, but the kind that turns waiting rooms into second homes and time into something you bargain with. Elena never left our side. No assistants. No press. Just her, sitting through long nights on plastic chairs, memorizing the rhythm of hospital machines. I watched her there, stripped of every title, and understood how deeply she had chosen us. Wealth can buy comfort, but it can't buy courage in moments like that. When the diagnosis finally came, manageable, treatable, but frightening, I broke down in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Elena held me while I cried, not as a billionaire fixing a problem, but as a woman loving a family. She asked doctors questions I was too scared to ask. She listened when my daughter whispered that she was afraid. She stayed steady when I couldn't. That experience changed the way the world looked at us, too. Word spread quietly among people who mattered less to Elena than they did to me. Nurses noticed. Teachers noticed. Neighbors who once whispered now waved. They saw her not as someone untouchable, but as someone present. And slowly, the weight I'd been carrying, the fear of not belonging, began to lift. There was backlash, of course. There always is when a woman with power chooses love over image. Articles questioned her judgment. Strangers online questioned mine. I read one comment that said I was lucky. I laughed for the first time in days. Luck had nothing to do with nights spent praying under fluorescent lights. One evening, after my daughter finally came home, Elena and I sat on the floor surrounded by medicine bottles and crumpled drawings. She told me she'd spent her life proving she was untouchable. That loving us had taught her the strength of being vulnerable. I told her I'd spent mine believing survival meant staying small. That she'd taught me to stand. We didn't make promises that night. We didn't need to. Commitment had already revealed itself in action. Months later, at a small school ceremony, my daughter stood on a stage and thanked the people who stayed when I was scared. She looked at me. Then at Elena. The room went silent. Elena's hand found mine, trembling. In that moment, every risk, every doubt, every empty seat from our past felt worth it. I realized then that the seat her ex walked out on hadn't been a loss. It had been an opening. Because love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just sits down. And refuses to leave.